This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 42.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today in session 42 of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. Today I am bringing back Pat Friman for the third time on this program. I am so excited to share our conversation on public speaking. If you know anything about conferences in our line of work, you know that Pat Friman is a much sought after speaker. Usually the sessions that he talks at are standing room only, and he is just one of the best in our field at doing this. So he comes on the podcast today to share his secrets. Well, actually, they're not so secret. He actually published a few articles on effective tutorials or effective ways of public speaking in a tutorial format, and I will link to those in the show notes. But that notwithstanding, he comes on and kind of tells us about how he approaches giving a talk, how to introduce yourself, how to master the both beginning and ending of your talk, and some of the goals you should think about when you are designing a presentation, and so on and so forth. It's great stuff. It's stuff that you can use tomorrow, which is one of the things I really like about the types of information that he brought to bear in today's conversation. Before we get to that, I want to let you know that this episode is brought to you with the support of Chartlytics. And Chartlytics is a single comprehensive system for behavior reduction and academic improvement through precision teaching. And what they've done is modernize the science of PT by simplifying the data collection, visual analysis, and reporting processes. They are also provide a lot of educational opportunities. They offer a intensive 2-day workshop on PT and the standard acceleration chart all across the U.S. As you know, I went to one recently, and boy, it was a mind-blowing experience. And I think that it is something that if you are not familiar with this stuff, I would go ahead and at least investigate it to see if it's right for you. One way to go about that would be to head on over to chartlytics.com/Matt, and on that page you will find a PT starter pack, and that would include a free ebook and a 1-credit CE tutorial on standard acceleration charting and precision teaching and so forth. So that's a really low effort way to kind of dip your toe in the water and see if this is something you want to learn more about. So again, that's chartlytics.com/Matt. And this podcast is also brought to you by Operant Coffee. Yes, Operant Coffee is the sponsor that I introduced in session 41. And their mission is to help you serve amazing coffee while promoting environmentally safe and sustainable behavioral business practices. All of the Operant Coffee blends are roasted with fair trade certified coffee beans and made in partnership with Philly Fair Trade Roasters. Their coffee is made from the blends of beans from Central and South America and the Pacific Islands. Their roasters are committed to saving the world with sustainable behavioral business practices. And during the production of roasting and blending the coffee, they compost, recycle, and limit waste. They are also committed to supporting fair trade practices to ensure that farmers that produce the coffee continue to work in a safe and reinforcing environment. This provides us with a product that is not only of high quality, but also environmentally friendly. As a nod to our behavior analysis roots, Operant Coffee also provides a fun operant fact on every label. So that's their advertising copy. And just to kind of go off script here for a minute, I have sampled the offerings from Operant Coffee, and boy, it's really good stuff. And I'm kind of picky about coffee, to be honest. So anyway, if you want to go to operantcoffee.com, you can check out what they have to offer. And if you want to save a few bucks on your order, you can use the promo code BehaviorPodcast. So thank you, Chartlytics. Thank you, Operant Coffee, for sponsoring this episode. And without any further ado, please enjoy this fun conversation with the incomparable Pat Friman. Hey, Pat Friman, welcome back to the Behavioral Observations podcast. This is appearance number 3, so thanks for joining us again.
No, thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to do it.
So I guess my first question is, given this is your third appearance on the show, can you talk a little bit about how your life has now changed as a result of being featured, not once, not twice, but now 3 times?
Well, now I drive a Mercedes and I live in a much bigger house in a much nicer part of town, and I really credit the podcast to all of that. Thank you so much, Matt. I guess it's improved my love life. I know that much. Now I have a following, and I never had a following before. And there's so many more elements to this. I just I couldn't be more thankful, Matt.
So do people now stop?
Am I answering your question?
Yeah. I just want, All right.
So it's made me pay more attention to the program, and I think it does a real service to our field, to be honest. And people, they find time to listen to a podcast that they wouldn't have available to delve into a journal article or a book, because they're often listening in the car or while on a plane in their headphones. And so filling in those gaps with useful information rather than books on tape about mysteries or westerns, I think is a real service to people in our field, maybe even people outside the field. And I just like being part of that.
Well, thanks. Your episodes are insanely popular with our listeners, and it's because of folks like you and others who've taken a risk to come on, a fairly new medium that's made it helpful or made it popular, if you will. So, thanks so much.
Whenever I'm in a group that includes Greg Hanley, I always feel good about that.
Awesome. Yeah. As an aside, his podcast, so we have over 450,000 total downloads since I started this podcast almost 2 years ago. And I think about 100,000 of those are Greg Hanley, are the 3 episodes that Greg Hanley's been on. And this is, I think, the 42nd episode. So
yeah, I'm not at all surprised about that.
Yeah, that certainly speaks to his popularity and the
topic
as well.
I learn when I listen to him talk.
Oh.
I always learn something from him.
Well, that's an awesome segue, Pat. See, this is just I didn't even mean to do that. So we're going to talk about talks today. I think folks like yourself and Greg, kind of turned the term keynote into a verb. In terms of I'm keynoting this, I'm keynoting that, and because you guys are so good at this stuff, and I know you've written a lot about public speaking, you've done workshops about public speaking, if I'm not mistaken, at last year's APBA in New Orleans, and so I thought it'd be fun to have you on the show to talk a little bit more about that. So I know you have some very specific points of view on this topic, but let me start with perhaps an unusual, I don't know if this is an unusual question or not, and I'm going to apologize in advance for my middle school language. But Pat, have you ever sucked at public speaking? Like, did you ever just lay an egg or bomb, as to use a comedy term?
I gave a talk to a group of physical therapists at the University of Nebraska Med School. And it was going pretty well. I was talking about behavioral pediatrics. And I went to make a point about a developmental level that children need to attain or achieve in order to begin to see the world relationally. It's that Piagetian level called concrete operations. We would just think of it as derived relational responding. They're pretty much the same thing. And I went to make the point, and I consulted my thoughts, and they weren't there. And so I completely blanked on what I was going to say next. And I didn't know then what I know now. And so I panicked. And I was a whisker hair away from just rushing out of the room and telling them that I was sick. And that was the thought that occurred to me. So everything was tanking right then. And I think it was pretty apparent to them that was what was happening. But a little voice in my head said, just say anything. just keep talking. And so I said, is anybody in here Catholic? It was apropos of nothing. I mean, it wasn't in any way related to what I had been talking about. It was just something that came into my head. And of course, this is Omaha, Nebraska, one of the most Catholic cities in America. So almost every hand in the room went up. And so then I started to talk a little bit about the Catholic religion and their concept of sin. And they've got a division of or taxonomy of sin. You've got a mortal sin and a venial sin. Mortal sin is like a felony, and a venial sin is like a misdemeanor. And if you commit a mortal sin and you don't get it like confessed and forgiven, and then you die, you go to hell. But you can't commit a mortal sin until you're 7. And this is me talking to them. And as soon as I got to the age 7, I remembered what I was trying to say about Piaget, because I came all the way out and said, yeah, at about the age 7, kids can start to realize that things that look different can be the same. And this is a lot like the concept of sin. And I was just making it up as I was going along. And so in the middle of that talk was a potential to have me never, ever again do any public speaking. But I discovered something that I definitely advocate, and that is when a person is up in front of an audience and they blank, all they need to do is keep talking. And inevitably, as a function of derived relational responding, they'll find their way back to their point and tie it all together. I also learned that they're really not listening that carefully to me anyway, because now when I'm training public speakers, I will deliberately try to get them to lose their train of thought and then encourage them just to say gibberish in the middle and then pick up their point again. And I'll do that. I'll demonstrate it for them. I'll be talking like I'm talking to you. I'm just talking about public speaking, and all of a sudden I say like, and then when the trash overflows from the top of the bin and gets on the ground, animals can get at that, and you got to go out there and pick that up. Anyway, about public speaking, when you lose your place, you should just keep on talking. The audience doesn't think, well, what's the matter with that guy talking about trash? They think, I should listen more carefully. What was that about the trash again? And so it's a twofold point. One is keep talking, you'll find your way back. And secondly, they're not paying that much attention anyway.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's pretty cool. So how long ago was that experience?
That was in 1986. One of my first ever talks at the University of Nebraska.
I see.
And I was banking on my ability to go around and talk to groups at the University of Nebraska to allow me to create a department of behavioral pediatrics. They didn't have one. They didn't even know what that was. And so I was talking about it with any group that would listen. So there was a lot at stake.
I was going to say, that sounds pretty, high stakes environment.
It's one way to make a difference or create a role for yourself in a medical school, is to get in front of the various audiences. And ultimately, the golden fleece of all that is the grand rounds. So if a psychologist is trying to create a program or a department or add on to an department in a medical school, if they can get a grand rounds assignment and then actually do a good grand rounds, they really set the stage for people paving the way for them.
I see. Okay. One of the things that I oftentimes think about is, if you're trying to do something, well, I was going to ask about what one should talk about as a behavior analyst, but let me back up a second and ask the question why. I know you have some thoughts on this in terms of why we should care about public speaking. Many BCBAs who are finishing school right now and entering the practice are going to be practitioners. In other words, they're not going to be academic types who might be speaking to a lecture hall full of young, impressionable youth, where the skills of capturing and maintaining an audience would be very beneficial, and so forth. What is the rationale for developing this skill from your point of view for the everyday behavior analyst?
Well, first and foremost, they're a person, not a behavior analyst. I mean, they're a behavior analyst, but a much larger sense, they're a person. And mastering, or at least becoming reasonably competent at public speaking, makes a person a more effective person in many different environments. I think most people are pretty afraid of public speaking, and a lot of people are walking around in the world kind of afraid of the world in a sense, hoping that nobody will call upon them and make them talk. Or somebody that masters public speaking, they're walking around in the world, they're not afraid, and on some level they're kind of hoping somebody will call on them and make them talk. That's a whole different relationship with the world. And it generates a whole different relationship with people. They're not as scary. And places where people congregate aren't as scary. There's always a need for somebody to do the talking. Somebody's got to do the eulogy. And I've been to a lot of funerals at my age, that's what happens. And I've watched people do these horrible eulogies because they're just not good at public speaking. And this may have been the first time they ever had to get up in front of an audience. And they just fall apart because they're consumed with grief. And they don't have a skill set to tap in order to get through the eulogy and have it serve the function that it's supposed to serve, which is to remind the people that are gathered who they lost. And instead, they just fall to pieces and blubber and then sit down. Somebody's got to do the eulogy, and you want it to be done well. The family wants it to be done well. If the deceased could rise up and make a bid, they'd want it to be done well. Somebody's got to give the toast in order to set the occasion for the dinner party. Somebody's got to stand up at the PTA and give their opinion. Somebody's got to stand up at the city council meeting and make their point. Somebody's got to get up in front of the classroom and give some kind of an account, some kind of a report, some kind of a story, some kind of a sketch. And then we'll boil it down to behavior analysts. You're talking about the ones that are in practice. Practice is heavily dependent upon referrals. Now, how do you get those referrals when you're just starting out? Well, the best way to get those referrals is to go out into the community and talk to referral sources, and not one at a time, preferably 20 or 50 at a time. Talk to a big group of teachers, talk to a big group of pediatricians, talk to a big parents group, and do a persuasive presentation of what you have to offer, and then you head back to your office, and the phone's lit up with people that are eager for your services. So even the practitioners, I think, benefit tremendously from mastering this skill.
Okay. So one of the things that I think puts people off about this are nerves, broadly speaking. And as we go through this, I've got quite a few questions from listeners. So as they are appropriate, I'll bring them up. So one of my listeners, Celia Heyman from the ABA study group, she says that she has some jitters just prior to speaking in large groups. She lessens this by being in the room early, meeting with attendees who are arriving, and it kind of allows her to, I guess, habituate or become accustomed to both the setting and the attendees and things like that. And as a result, the attendees become less of a stranger. Also, she talks about accepting that she doesn't need to know everything in order to communicate effectively or present effectively. Are there other strategies that you have to mitigate performance jitters? I mean, I remember I gave a brief talk at the New Hampshire ABA a few years back, and right before our panel got up, Willie DeLeon gave an awesome talk, or at least from what I understand, it was awesome, but because I couldn't pay attention to it because I was freaking out.
In your head.
Yeah. I want to go back and ask him more quick. Okay, what exactly was that about? Because I was in sheer panic. I usually get a little nervous when I speak publicly, but that was probably the largest group that I've presented to ever, and obviously presenting in front of your peers, as opposed to lay people, I think, at least for me, creates another level of stakes, if you will. So, can you talk a little bit about how to mitigate or at least deal with being nervous like that?
Well, I like to plan the uh, woman that you spoke of earlier. What was her name again?
Celia Heyman.
Celia. I like Celia's plan is good. She goes into the room and beforehand and sizes it up. Maybe I recommend getting up on stage and visualizing the audience in front of you, saying some things to them privately if there are people in the room, publicly if they're not, just to get the feel of what it's going to be like to stand up there. And you use the word habituate. That seems to work as well as anything, or to let the powers of extinction actually work. And then I will walk the entire room just to get a bird's eye view of the audience from the audience's perspective. If there's equipment to test, I'll do that. I'll sit in the chairs, just generally getting accustomed to the stimulus situation I'll be in, getting my, if you want to put it this way, nerves to calm down about it. But there are other things I recommend. One is to over practice the first 5 minutes of your talk and the last 5 minutes of your talk. A high level of preparation on the front end so that 5 minutes virtually becomes automatic behavior. And I'm not saying memorize it. I'm saying practice it.
I see. That's a good point, Pat, because your good buddy in Kentucky, Brandon Franklin, has a question related to that. He says, Pat's delivery is so smooth. I want to know what he does to prepare for a presentation. And so you started to talk about the first 5 minutes. What makes the first 5 minutes so crucial? And again, what do you do to kind of, what are the elements of a good, I'm using air quotes here, but a good first 5 minutes?
Well, the first 5 minutes that's the time that the speaker is the most nervous. That's when they descend to the stage for the first time. They're facing the audience, the first time they're consulting their thoughts. They haven't gotten themselves warmed up yet. They haven't gotten any behavioral momentum established. That's where their doubts are most likely to be the strongest. But if they have this profound amount of preparation for that 5 minutes, those issues aren't nearly as big. As for what goes into that 5 minutes, the first thing should be your introduction. I mean, if you're going to do an introduction consistent with what I recommend, then you'll be doing your own introduction. If you've already been introduced, which is often the case, that'll be a formal introduction. Usually it'll elevate the audience's expectations of you because it'll talk about how important you are and all the wonderful things you've done. I don't think that's a particularly good way to start off. I'd rather have the audience's expectations lowered a little bit. Be that as it may, if they do the introduction, you can still introduce yourself just on a more personal level. So that is a segue into introducing your talk, and the first minute or two should be something that foreshadows what's going to happen in that talk and where you're going to land to give the audience an idea of how this is going to go. So I'm going to use a word that's outside of our field, but it's useful for this conversation. I recommend myelinizing the first 5 minutes. And myelinizing means practicing something so much that myelin accumulates in the neural network underlying the performance. So out here in Nebraska, people have a very well myelinized repertoire driving on dry pavement in the summertime. But their repertoire for driving on ice in the wintertime is not myelinized. The behavior is automatic on the dry pavement. The behavior is very focused and nerve-wracking on the ice. Most speakers, when they get up in front of an audience, are driving on ice. If they over-practice that first 5 minutes, it's more like driving on dry pavement.
So let's dig into that for a second, and to get at what Brandon was asking about, like what specific steps do you recommend that people do to practice? I've heard of things like talking about things in front of them, rehearsing your talk in front of a mirror, or would you gather small groups of victims or test subjects or whatever? What have you seen work well?
all of that. Mirror work is excellent. Then at least you have an audience of one. I also recommend imitating Demosthenes, one of the greatest orators of all time. He was a Greek who aspired to be a great statesman, but he had some deficiencies or some obstacles to overcome. One is he was easily winded. One is he. Sorry, this screen just went green. One is he had a weak voice, and, and he had a stammer, and so to prepare, he would go down to the ocean, put pebbles in his mouth, and give his talk. He would also run up and down sand dunes so that he'd be winded, and he learned to have a greater force to his speaking because he developed up a wind capacity. And then he would speak out over the waves and learn to have his voice carry, and went on to become one of the greatest orators of history. So I will practice when I'm out of breath. So if I'm working out in the morning, I'm in the gym, and I have to give a talk on the weekend, I'll be giving the first 5 minutes at least and the last 5 minutes at least during my workout while I'm out of breath, to prepare for a little bit of panic setting in where you get out of breath. I don't want anything to get in the way of my delivery. And even seasoned speakers sometimes get nervous, and the physiological accompaniment of nervousness is a change in the way the body uses oxygen. All of a sudden it's using oxygen to manage that threat response, and you don't have as much available for speaking unless you take deeper breaths. But you have to know to take deeper breaths in order to get the oxygen you need. So another way to do it is just to practice speaking while you're a little bit out of breath and get good at that. So I'll do that. Sometimes I'll practice walking up and down stairs. I will gather together a group of people if I can find them and present the trickier parts of what I want to speak about. That's a good way to practice. I'll practice in the car with loud music on so that I get better at any kind of distraction. I want to be able to talk past distractions or talk as if the distraction isn't there. So am I answering your question?
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of different. I think all that stuff is. I think the listeners really like the granular level of different ways in which they can prepare for these types of events. And it made me wonder when you were going through that list. So I have to imagine that public speaking for you has to be like driving on dry pavement at a certain level, given the amount of times you've done it. Now, that's an assumption on my part, so correct that if it's wrong. But I guess the larger question here is, does Pat Friman get nervous before a keynote still in 2007, soon to be 2018?
Yeah. I'm terrified of public speaking. I always have been, and I always will be.
So I
know that's like
I'm having a hard time. I know I'm not accusing you of telling stories here, Pat, but I just having seen you present so many times. I just find that amazing.
Yeah. You're not going to see it. But it's present. I mean, if you could like have a visual of my anatomy and physiology as it's operating while I'm speaking, you'd be able to tell. You know, if you had my heart rate and blood pressure up on a monitor, then you go, wow, this guy he's cranked. I didn't do any public speaking until I was in my mid-30s because I was so afraid of it. And I thought the only way to be a public speaker would be to get over the fear first and to get up on stage with no fear present. And that was going nowhere. And then I saw a T-shirt one day and it said, feel the fear and do it anyway. And I thought about that. And I thought, I wonder if that is what I need to do with public speaking. And I read a little bit about it and I liked the idea. And I thought that's my only option. And so I started agreeing to do public speaking events and got to practice speaking while afraid. And that's what I'm really good at, is I can talk when I'm afraid. So well that when I tell my interns who are about to do a front of the room exercise with me that I know they're afraid, but they're not nearly as afraid as I am, they don't believe me because they can't see it. And so they think it's just some story I'm telling to make them feel better. But that's not the case. It always scares me. However, there's another little, I guess, I don't want to call it a trick because that kind of trivializes it, but let's call it a method. And it has some science behind it. That is, if you can reframe the fear and think of it as excitement, it actually serves the presentation and the person that does it pretty well. And I do that. Because we're fundamentally talking about bodily states that are similar if you're going on a roller coaster and you love roller coasters, or if you're going up on a stage to give a talk, but you hate giving talks. The physiology involved in those two is pretty similar. It's just that we contextualize one differently as something that we're excited about, and the other one is something we're terrified of. So I've gotten pretty good at it, actually, contextualizing the bodily reaction I have because I'm afraid of public speaking as excitement rather than fear.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you giving us the inside view, if you will. Again, I still find that humorous to think that you get nervous, but and I was just thinking as you're talking about, the kind of myelinization analogy, if that would, if the cues that evoke that anxiety or whatever would extinguish over time, or be less effective over time. But we'll put that aside for now. So I want to turn back to the preparation piece. You talked about having your first 5 minutes down, and you talked about the kind of essential elements of what the first 5 minutes should focus on. You also talk about really nailing the last 5 minutes. And I'm referring specifically to the book chapter you did and the article you had in the Behavior Analyst, and I'll have the links to both of those in the show notes.
Okay.
For people to check out. What are the essential elements of the last 5 minutes?
The last 5 minutes is where a speaker should reach for a universal point. It's what poets do with poetry. They start with a specific, a leaf is falling gently from a tree, and they end on a universal. And as is the case with the tree, we all shall pass through this life and fall gently onto the earth. Something. You go from a specific to a universal. And so the average presenter in behavior analysis starts out with a specific, which is a research question and a study. And then when they get all the way done with their talk, I recommend that they end on some universal point that's relevant to everybody, regardless of their orientation. I always end on the circumstantial view of behavior being the most powerful idea ever invented by mankind. So that's a point that's universal enough that it encapsulates all aspects of behavior analysis, because every piece of behavior analysis has a foundation in the circumstantial view of behavior, that behavior is a function of its environmental circumstances. And I recommend that speakers try to come up with a universal point that they can regularly end on. And when they do that, it almost becomes a little bit more like preaching than it does presenting, because you're really trying to convert people to a point of view that has a universal dimension. And I don't think that kids that get up in front of the audiences at ABAI have the sense of universality that I want them to have. I think they're just getting up on the stage hoping they can survive long enough to get their study discussed in a way that doesn't embarrass their advisor. I guess that's a great way to start, but there's so much more potential on that stage than I think they're seeing. Once they're up there, they have that audience then they can do anything they want with that audience. And one of the things I think they should try and do is make a profound point as they exit the stage.
And I know that you're not a fan of Q&A sessions as a way to end a talk. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, that's not a classroom. The classroom is the place for the questions, not the presentation. The presenter should end on a universal point and leave the stage and let that universal point sit there. It's like kill them and leave is what I recommended in my paper. Is hit them hard with a powerful point and walk off that stage so they don't even have you to think about anymore. They just have that point. But if you take questions, then you have an individual that asks a question, and that question is important to that person. The chances of it being important to everybody in the room is pretty slim. The chances of it even being important to the speaker are pretty slim. But it's important to that one person. So if you want to deal with that person, answer their question after the talk is over on the side of the room. I just came from a conference, and all the speakers before me took questions, and in my opinion, they gave great talks, but their talks were diminished by the questions. The quality of the questions were not consistent with the quality of the talk. The questions weren't directly pertinent to the theme of the talk, and the speaker hadn't prepared to answer those questions. And so there's just sort of a diminution of the quality of the whole thing when you entertain questions from the audience. Now, I'm not saying that we wouldn't answer questions. I'm just saying don't make the questions part of the presentation. Then the other thing is, people get to the end of their talk, they're at the end of their time limit, and then they say, are there any questions? And if there's a bunch of questions, now they're going over their time limit. Well, that's not a neutral event. So they're eating into the time of the next speaker, pushing everything back so they can answer questions from the audience. And that's just not right. You should never go over your time limit because it's not a neutral thing. You're taking from somebody else.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. But given the kind of ubiquity of the I'll take some questions from the audience tactic, have you got any pushback with regard, has anyone challenged you on that? I'm just curious to see what the response has been, because I read that idea of yours as, to not take questions for the reasons you just stated. I happen to agree with that. I never thought of it prior to reading that, and based on that, it kind of makes a lot of sense. For me, have you had any reactions that people are like, well, that's disrespectful or anything like that? What has been the response to that? That might seem a little controversial.
I keep expecting to get blowback from just about all the stuff I say. And I
well, that's a podcast for another day, Pat. That might be the fourth appearance,
I don't really. I haven't had anybody critique that point or any of the points that I made. I think if a person was kind of on the fence about that, they should attend, say, one of my talks where I don't take any questions, and then attend a series of talks afterwards where they do take questions and see which one they like better. Also, I think if you end your talk on a universal point that resonates with the audience, there are not going to be any questions. Because who wants to ask a question to take away from that point?
Mm-hmm. And I think that goes back to I think one of the things, if I'm recalling correctly from either of those articles, is that you talk about it as being a performance, not more than a presentation.
Yeah, yes, it's a performance. And it's done in the service of something bigger than the speaker, and that is this message, this universal message. We've got an idea that's central to our field. People don't talk about it that much. I wish they talked about it more. But we're trying to usher this idea out into the world because we believe that the world would be a better place if more people adopted the idea. And that is that behavior is a function of environmental circumstances. And so, in my opinion, every presentation is an opportunity to disseminate that idea further and wider. And so all speakers could end on a note that suggests that's the case. And that's a universal point. It's an important point. And if their performance, as I call it, is successful, then at least the people in the room will be a little bit more persuaded than they were before they came into that room. So I think it's the presentation, I guess, that's for the classroom. The questions are for the classroom. I don't consider a conference presentation to be a classroom. It's got a loftier function than that.
All right, so let's dig into a couple of specific questions about presenting. Two topics I want to cover. One are slides, and I know that no one likes to go to a talk and have people read directly from slides, right? That's especially if they're really dense with text. I mean, that's a huge pet peeve of mine, and I think it's getting better. In my view, I think people are kind of getting hip to that idea of less is more. But what are your suggestions for best practices for slide usage?
Consult Derek Reed.
Okay.
I mean, I really think that's what I would do, or read his papers. That he's a slide master, a Zen master of slides. But in general, less is more. I think it would even be better if the majority of slides that behavior analysts use were pictures rather than with text-based points. And if there are text-based points, that text is there to evoke behavior on the part of the speaker, not reading on the part of the speaker. And with a lot of practice of their presentation, a couple of words will evoke a large verbal repertoire. And it's challenging for the audience to have a very wordy slide. And while they're reading that slide, they're not paying attention to what the speaker is saying, and so a lot gets lost right there. And then there's this, obsession about the database slides and going over the data segment by segment. I consider that completely unnecessary.
So I was going to ask about that. Like, well, okay, I get reducing text, but what if you have what if you're not giving a keynote per se, where you're trying to develop and communicate an overarching theme, but if you are, let's say, at Squab, right? And you are.
I tried to get into Squab; they wouldn't let me in.
Let's pretend for a minute they did, right? The velvet rope got lifted, and you were able to you disguised yourself or whatever, so I don't want to pick on Squab exclusively, but let's say you had something that was very dense with data.
Let me pick on Squab for you.
Okay.
Let me pick on Squab for you. Okay, so that's a geeky crowd, a very geeky crowd, and their presentations are very technically precise and very data oriented, and we absolutely have to have that. That geeky crowd supplied all the empirical and conceptual foundations for our field. And they are communicating to each other. They don't take pains to communicate to larger audiences because they're more interested in getting it right than they are in getting it across. And I bless that. But very few of the people in our field are truly geeky. We need more marketers. We need more disseminators. We need more salespeople. So if it's truly a scientific group that is only interested in the accuracy of the data that are being presented, then you got to go over your data very carefully. But very few of our presentational contexts are like that. And what behavior analysts need to get better at is telling stories. And the data is not the story. And if you make the data the story, then you got a really boring presentation, and it doesn't make very much of a point. So it's like when you buy a house, it's really important that the house has a foundation, has solid joists and rafters, but that's not why people buy houses. I mean, they want to make sure they're there. They might even have the inspector do that for them. They want to go through room to room to room to see what it'd be like to live in that house. And in my opinion, it's similar with the presentation. The data is the foundation. It's the floor joists, the roof rafters. It's important that you have it. But what we really want to know is the story that data allows you to tell. And the story is bigger than the data. And generally, behavior analysts don't tell stories. As a result, what they have to communicate isn't that compelling, except to other behavior analysts. And even then, I'm not sure about that.
Well, let me echo your recommendation to check out a Derek Reed talk. Derek Reed joined us at this year's New Hampshire ABBA, and he is one who actually does present at Squab and is able to really tell a humorous, funny story, and funny story about behavioral economics, which is a really hard thing to pull off. And his slides are like movies almost. It's really cool what he does. So guys who are listening, folks who are listening at home, if you are attending a conference and you see an opportunity to see Derek, I would definitely go ahead and check that out. He's really, really good at that stuff. And again, this is a good segue because he, both like you and like Greg, he has a really funny way of. He's very humorous in the way he presents this material, which I think helps. And I do want to talk about humor too. I've been struggling to figure out how to phrase this question. How do you know? In other words, I keep coming back to this idea of don't try this at home if you're not really funny. I'm like, should you try? And I've seen people try to insert, and I've maybe done this a time or two, if truth be told, maybe try to force a joke when a joke is not necessary.
Right.
Obviously, where you've done this for so long, where all the laugh lines are in your talks, I'm assuming, and things like that. And even the opening question to this interview, tell me how your life has changed since being on the podcast. That was I was prepared for that to bomb, and I wanted to use that as an object lesson of not trying this at home, and you saved me, so I appreciate that. So talk to us about when, should, how, etc. to use humor.
If it's going to be self-generated humor, I recommend doing it if you know how. And people that know how know that they know how, because they've gone through life and they've had humorous asides, witty responses to conversations, comical observations of the passing scene, and people have laughed, and so they know how to do it. And so as they construct their talk, they can construct segments of it that have those aspects. But if you don't know how, and then you're going to try and do it anyway in a very stressful situation like a public presentation, the chances of it succeeding go way down. And it isn't necessary. It isn't necessary to be humorous. Don Baer wasn't a particularly humorous guy, but he was really effective in front of the room. Never made jokes, and he read his papers. And I recommend against reading your paper, unless you're Don Baer and can do it that well, because he read them conversationally. Ogden Lindsley was hilarious. Murray Sidman doesn't make jokes. Both of them were incredibly effective at creating a strong listening in the audiences that they were in front of. I think it's an asset if you're able to use humor in your presentations, but not a necessary asset. And so I don't recommend forcing it. However, it doesn't have to be self-generated. We have access to millions of pictures on the internet now, and you can find pictures and embed them into your presentation that give the points you're making kind of a humorous dimension. And it doesn't have to come from you necessarily. It just comes from a picture you selected. Or you can put a joke in, a joke slide, and that's not a bad idea as long as the joke serves the point you're trying to make and you don't read the joke. And that's what people do, where I think is a mistake. Is they stick the humorous slide up there and then they read the caption. And the audience can read. and they can get the joke. So I have a slide I use for my talks on enuresis. It's a picture of a guy laying on a couch and a psychotherapist with a notebook at the head of the couch. And the psychotherapist says to the guy, "You're a bedwetter? Get off the couch." And I don't read that joke. I just put it up on the screen, and then I make a point. And that point I make is, what I want from families is them to be more interested in protecting the bed than protecting the kid from enuresis, because it really is an innocuous condition, and we don't need to overamp on it from a psychological perspective. I never say anything about that slide. The slide and its punchline is buttressing my point. That's the way to use a joke slide. So you can add those in. Those lighten up the mood. I think, and people are doing that more and more, I think, because they have so much access to all those pictures that bring a lighthearted aspect to their talk. And did I answer your question?
Yeah. And, I attended a talk at a conference that was not a behavior analytic conference. It was a marketing conference. And the midday keynote, I think all the slides were emojis. And there were just different emojis to drive home points and things like that. I don't think there was really any text at all in the slides. And I was talking to the presenter afterwards, and he said he read a book called Presentation Zen.
I've got it right on my shelf here.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, guys. And that's kind of what drove him to kind of go in that more minimalistic type of slide format.
Yeah.
So, because I think we all struggle, like if we get in the opportunity to speak publicly, what sometimes the first thing, or at least I know I've done, is okay, well, open up PowerPoint or open up Keynote and start hammering away. And that can sometimes take the form of lots of text and all sorts of other things that could work against us, I guess.
I know you probably have a direction you want to go, but how about if I amplify that point just a bit?
Yeah, go right ahead.
But about preparation,
yes,
when
please.
You just got the invitation to give a talk, and now what happens?
That actually happened to me. I was invited to speak at a state conference, so I'm all ears, Pat. So.
Okay, so you got what they want you to talk about. You at least try to get that from them, or come up with something on your own that they like. But you have that in mind, whatever the topic is. So now it's firmly in mind. You know what it is. Keep it there and walk around in the world, and the world will supply relevant information to that topic. Now, the information's already out there in the world. It just isn't presenting itself to you because you haven't pre-programmed yourself to see it. It's like when you own a particular make of car. Like I have a Mercedes C300. How many Mercedes C300s have you seen in the last week, do you think?
I live in rural New Hampshire, and it's there's a foot of snow on the ground, so there's not a lot.
Well, I mean, even if it was dry pavement, unless you have one, you probably don't see them.
Right.
I see them everywhere because I have one. So having one pre-programs me to see C300s in the world. When I'm going to start a talk, when I've just gotten the topic, I pre-program myself to walk around in the world and gather information relevant to that subject. And then I capture it, either on my phone in the notes section or in a little notebook I carry around with myself. And when I have a fair amount of information, then I open up PowerPoint and start creating perspective slides based on what the world has told me about this idea. And then I print those out with the notes view and continue to do the same thing. And I stay in that mode, the assess the world to find relevant information to my perspective topic mode for as long as I can before I actually have to, actually create the thing and start working on it and practicing it. And the world's been very, very generous with information when it comes to my subjects. that's a creative process.
Mm-hmm.
And you're using a particular repertoire, a generative repertoire. What we're after is volume here, or quantity. And once you have a lot of volume or a lot of quantity, then you can use a different process, one you might call the editing process, the critical process. You take all this information that the world has been generously giving you, and then you winnow it down to stuff that's useful and get rid of the stuff that's not. And I recommend staying in that generative, quantitative process as long as you can, because you'll get a lot of information. But at some point, you got to switch over and be critical and edit and cut and remove. And what you have left is your talk.
I see. It sounds like a comedian who does observational comedy and is writing, writing their act, probably walking around looking for, those sorts of things.
I think you'd find it's actually central to all the artistic expression in the world, is that the artists are gathering first and using what they've gathered as their raw material for their creation.
Awesome.
And this process, this constructing a talk, is a creative process. And I don't think, once again, behavior analysts haven't had as much to say about creativity as maybe they could. I know Robert Epstein did a fair amount of that early on, but there hasn't been much since.
So to that point, Sarah Leadley, who's writing in all the way from New Zealand, says, how can university programs better equip students with public speaking skills for the effective dissemination of applied behavior analysis? And she continues here, often students are taught traditional academic presenting, i.e. PowerPoint, introduction, method, results, and so forth. And she observes that we find that most of our graduates, however, will spend the majority of their time in practice, where speaking about ABA is to non-academics, kind of getting back to what you're saying earlier. And they're talking about in her, based on the context of her question, I'm making an assumption that she's in a university setting. In 2018, we were switching some of our courses to more TED-style talks, limited or no slides, shorter times, and so forth. She wants to know if that seems like a good idea or other things that they should consider as it relates to.
That's a fantastic idea. That's exactly the direction they should be going in. That skill will serve those folks better than that formalized, data-based presentation that's done for scientific conferences. I'm not saying they shouldn't be trained to do that, but maybe it wouldn't be as beneficial to them if they weren't going to go into a university setting. If they're going to go into a university setting, they got to be able to do that. But they should also be able to do that other thing, which is to communicate to people outside the field effectively, because we are trying to disseminate ideas, particularly the idea that behavior is a function of circumstances. And it's important to realize that the dissemination of an idea is heavily dependent upon the ease of the means of transmission. And those very technical presentations, they don't transmit easily, except to people that are kind of on the inside. But those TED-like talks, they transmit incredibly well because they are composed in a way that can be consumed very easily by the average educated individual. So I think that's a great idea for her students. And I think it would be good for them to, I've been in a university setting, and it's often difficult to get a new course put into the curriculum. But I think it's worthwhile to work on a new course for the curriculum, one on public speaking. And if they did that, there's a good chance that a bunch of students outside the field of behavior analysis would want to take that class. So I think they're definitely going in the right direction.
Cool. A related question from Ryan O'Donnell, and Ryan is a buddy of mine. He also is he has his own podcast, the Why We Do What We Do show, and it's pretty cool. So for those of you listening who haven't checked it out, you might want to check that out. But he writes in, Pat, if you could wave a wand and start over, would you make any changes in your approach to disseminating behavior analysis? Also, what areas are we lacking in as a culture that we should focus on? In other words, do we need to do more, podcasts, YouTube channels, other avenues for dissemination or at least communication?
Well, in response to the first part of the question, if I could wave a wand and do anything over again, I don't think so. Maybe start earlier. 'Cause I got started late. I didn't go to graduate school till I was 31. Um, Maybe if I would have went on time, when I was 22 or 23, I would have been able to put a little more time on the clock and maybe produced a little bit more than I've been able to. But in terms of how I was able to construct my education and my career, I think I did it exactly the way I wanted to do it. I mean, my advisors are Don Baer, Montrose Wolf, and Todd Brisley. My postdoctoral supervisor was the founder of behavioral pediatrics. My first job was at Johns Hopkins, and my next job was at the University of Pennsylvania. I don't know that I could have done it any better. And all along the way, I was developing capacity for public speaking because it was a necessary part of the job as I saw it. So as far as my own career is concerned, I don't know that I would do it any differently. As far as what we need to do as a field, what we need to become is much better ambassadors for this field. I shudder at the extent to which we are insistent upon people outside the field using the technical language of our field. Skinner invented this language to distinguish his approach to science or his approach to behavior from other approaches to behavior. I'm not completely convinced that the vocabulary was necessary. And we're the only hard science that is that insistent about people using our language to describe the phenomenon of interest, which is behavior. We're not talking about something that's only located on the surface of a distant planet nobody's ever seen before. We're not talking about something that's only located 20,000 leagues beneath the sea nobody's seen before. We're not talking about something that can only be seen through the lens of an electron microscope that nobody's seen before. If we were, well, then people would want to be educated about it, and they'd accept our names for this stuff because they wouldn't have names themselves. But we're just talking about behavior. They see it just as well as we do. They talk about it just as much as we do. We just have a funnier way of talking about it, which is fine. Then we go around and insist that they talk about it our way. That's not fine. We should talk about it their way and bring them around to the fundamental assumption, which is that behavior isn't necessarily a function of character or morality or psychology, but much more so of circumstances. And if podcasts and maybe TED-like talks and maybe public forums and maybe even getting on afternoon consumer interest shows on TV, any way that you can get out there and talk to people, I think is a good idea, as long as you're talking in plain, ordinary language. They don't need tact. They got label. Right. They don't need man. They've got request, and they will never need autoclitic under any circumstances. So I just don't think we're going to get anywhere trying to correct their grammar. Nobody likes the grammar police. Like I come up to somebody and they're a member of the grammar police. I say, you're hard to put up with. And they say, well, you shouldn't end a sentence in a preposition. And I go, oh, okay, well, you know what? You're hard to put up with, doofus. How's that?
There you go. Well, I appreciate you taking that aside into the plain speak. That was a question that Lupe Castaneda wrote in, and sounds like you covered it quite nicely. So I have a question from someone who attended your workshop in New Orleans at APBA. So she took you up on your challenge to get in front of the room, and
wow.
Amanda Nara, she did a presentation at the New York ABA conference a little while back, and
right. Congratulations, Amanda. Good for you.
Yeah. She and I think she talked about fears of public speaking and extended the challenge to the audience as well. So this is kind of a little bit of a chain you guys have going on here. So she asks kind of like a two-part question. Some of the stuff I think we've already covered, so answer any part of it you like here. So does Pat have any suggestions on where to market ourselves to engage in public speaking? Schools, doctor's office, other related conferences, etc. Does he have suggestions on how to market yourself to practice public speaking? For example, would I just contact local schools and ask to do a presentation? Do I ask them what they would like presentations on, or do I offer ones that I want to do? And she was also looking for suggestions of ideas for presentations to various audiences. So, of those things that would be popular to talk about that would resonate with the concerns, needs, etc. of lay people. She was going to kind of create her own kind of list of presentations, but doesn't really want to reinvent the wheel. If there are things that off the top of your head and from your perspective that would be, kind of home run topics.
Well, I've been sort of fortunate when that's concerned, that I've always been part of an organization into which people would send requests for speakers. I've got an intern working for me now, and he wants to be a better public speaker, and so he's asked me how to get invitations, and he's an unknown entity. So he's done some of the things that Amanda suggested that she might do. He's gotten in touch with schools and parent groups and asked them if they needed a speaker, and so far he hasn't had an invitation yet. And I haven't been in on that end of this domain because people do call frequently wherever I've been and ask. What I did do all along the way was make it known that I was willing. So when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, for example, that was at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, arguably the most influential children's hospital in the world. And the news stations in the Delaware Valley would frequently call CHOP, that's what it's called, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, call CHOP and ask for somebody to comment on the child issue of the day, the child issue du jour. And I was in the psychology department, and there wasn't, I knew they were asking because somebody had called the chair, and every single faculty person declined. Some because they were nervous, some because they thought it was beneath them. When I got wind of that, I said, absolutely, I am your man. Give him my phone number. And I hadn't done much of that before. My advisor, Ed Christopherson, had done a lot of stuff on TV in Kansas City. I used to watch him do it. I just thought, well, this is a tremendous way to learn it. And I was on TV commenting on various issues, 2 or 3 times a month over the 2 years I was there. So the point of that is to watch for opportunities and snap them up when they occur. The world always needs speakers. You just don't know what part of the world, has the interest unless they get in touch with you. I think it's a good idea to kind of canvass the world and see if anybody would like a speaker, and you might hit something, get something there. And it depends on what you have to offer. Like if you're trying to set up a practice, a child-oriented practice, pediatricians are always interested in having referral sources they can count on. Pediatricians always form groups. The groups always have a group meeting. They always have an agenda, and in that agenda, they usually include a speaker. If you can get on that agenda, then you got an option there that benefits your practice of public speaking and might benefit your child practice as well. Similarly, schools need people to come in and talk to their teachers and to their students periodically throughout the year. Make yourself available. They may invite you, especially if on the front end you don't charge anything. Mm-hmm. I'm at a point now that unless the organization that invites me is one that Boys Town is committed to, I will charge people to have me come and speak to them, because given my role here at Boys Town and in my clinic, every hour I'm away from here costs the institution money, so I'm going to get that money back somehow.
Got it.
So I guess I wish I had a clear-cut way to recommend to Amanda, but I don't, other than be available and beat the bushes.
Yep.
She already thought of that.
I think there's some good concrete first steps to take, so cool. I guess final question, and I think this is something that a lot of people kind of worry about when public speaking, and it's certainly something that I consider is, we talked about the beginning, we talked about the end, we talked about slides and things like that, but kind of in the middle, I guess, as I know we're kind of going all over the place from a chronological standpoint, but what do you have any recommendations for like filler words, like ums, ahs, likes, things like that?
I don't use them,
Right. Well, it kind of gets back to Brandon's point of you know when he noted the smoothness with which you present and things like that, and perhaps a lot of that is due to repetition and so forth. But
I,
as you're working with your supervisees, interns, etc., as they're developing their repertoires of public
yeah,
speaking skills, how do you or do you worry about it? Is this something you coach them on?
definitely. I mean, just pure and simple. They got to go. Those fillers have to go. But first, we have to find them. Um, and a person that uses fillers doesn't know that they use them, or they're not aware of the frequency of their use. So you have to have a committed listening audience to tell you where they are. It's painful because the best way to do it is to point out every instance, and that slows progress. But gradually, because of the punitive effect, they start to drop out. And the best way,
Pat, I've had some podcast listeners take data on them and send them in to me. So recording your voice is a painful instructor. But
I think the best
not that I've
advice
come close to mastering it either. But
well, the best thing I could recommend is to slow down. So let me give you an example of this. I don't know if this will come across on the radio, but this would be similar to how I am on stage. So I have a point I want to make about fillers. And it's an important point because so many people use them. Right? They can be distracting. How do you get them out of your repertoire? So you see those gaps
Yep.
that I've left between phrases? That's fine on stage. Those are better than filling them with sound. When you leave a little silent patch between thoughts, the audience ratchets up its listening. When you fill that little silent patch with meaningless words, it tends to take on a droning effect and they might tune out. So I think speakers need to realize that it's okay to slow their pacing down and to let a few patches of silence emerge between their thoughts, and they won't find the need to fill them up with and such and likewise and that kind of thing. And if you don't get somebody to fill you in on your use of fillers, then they are tick-like almost. And the speaker's not aware of them, but the audience almost always is. And it's at least mildly irritating if there's too many of them. And you don't want to be irritating your audience needlessly or distracting them needlessly.
I see.
I don't know, did I answer that question?
Yeah, you did. Yeah, it certainly gave me some things to consider moving forward.
There's a point I wanted to make that I don't know if you're going to get a question about. Is that all right?
Yeah. I think I'm out of listener questions, and so we can take this any direction you want.
Well, there's a point I make in both of my papers that's pretty important, and it's hard to define. It basically involves show up or be present. That's important. But I don't have a clear-cut way to recommend making it happen. I just know that it can be made to happen. I talked to this guy here in Omaha. His name is Billy McGuigan. He's a masterful musician. He and his brothers, Ryan and Matt, they put on this show, which is a Beatles cover show. They put on another show. It's a Buddy Holly cover show and a U2 cover show. But these aren't really cover shows because this Billy McGuigan is so incredibly talented when he's in front of the audience. It's not a Beatles show. It's the Billy McGuigan show. So I went out and had a drink with him a few weeks ago, he and his partner Kate. And I specifically wanted to ask him, how does he show up like that? Because when he's on stage, he's like the North Star. And then all the other members on the stage are kind of twinkling in the background. But I've also seen him on TV. It's the same thing on TV. It's like he just shows up vividly. And I just wanted to know if he knew steps to follow to make that happen.
I've heard people say that about like Clint Eastwood. When he's in a scene.
Yeah,
in a movie,
everybody else is equipped.
Yeah.
John Wayne was the same way. And I saw it with, remember, I don't know, this is dating me a little bit, but Connie Chung, you know that name?
Yes.
She used to be a news anchor with Dan Rather.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the studio watching her do the news one afternoon. I got invited there by a television producer that was doing some Boys Town business. And Dan Rather was off, so Connie Chung was going to be the anchor person for the evening news. And so I'm in the studio watching the stage, and there's this diminutive Asian woman sitting in a big chair with her head bowed. That's all I see. It's in the shadows. And then they count her down. 3, 2, 1. And the music for the news comes on, and then she lifts her head up. And I almost stumbled backwards. It was that she just like lit up the entire room with her face. And I thought, this is magic. There's something that woman knows how to do that the average human being doesn't know how to do. It's the same thing this Billy McGuigan has. It's this characteristic. It's almost like they turn themselves on like a flashlight. And I tried to get out of Billy how he does it. And what he told me was that when he gets up on stage, he just, I mean, I wish I could put it into more concrete terms, but he says he basically just goes for it. Meaning, sort of like jumping off a high dive. On the way up, you're full of self-doubts, you're worried and concerned. Once you jump, it's just the jump. That's all that's left. And so you're 100% in that jump. And when he makes the leap on stage, he has faith in his preparation. And so that he doesn't think about it anymore. He just leaps into the performance. And so he's 100% present during every element of his presentation while he goes through his shows. And I thought about my own presentations, and I realized that I'm not always at 100%. You know, sometimes I have like a nagging question in the back of my mind: am I getting this point across the way I want to? Is the pacing good? Is the audience paying attention? Why is that guy frowning? And all that takes away energy from the performance itself. And I think what he was saying is he doesn't do that. He is the performance. And that gave me an assignment, which is to learn how to do that. Learn how to turn myself on like a flashlight. Learn how to really show up powerfully so that I do everything that's humanly possible to grab every ounce of attention in that room and get it up on that stage.
Nice. Pat, so we are at well over an hour here, and I've kept you over the time that I promised you. I wanted to see if there was any other concluding thoughts on this topic or anything else you'd like to say to the audience.
Yeah, let me end on this point. We've got something to offer the world. It's paradigmatic, it's cataclysmic, it's revolutionary, it's transformative. And what it involves is switching what psychology has given the world is to think of human performance as involving haves, stuff people have. Our contribution is, no, it's stuff people do. So the people in the world have been told by psychologists that, you know, they have depression, they have anxiety, they have talent, they have confidence. And so people are looking, you know, where you got it, where is this? And sort of either you have it or you don't. Our contribution is, it's not a have, it's a do. Depression is a function of things that people do that bring on depressive states or depressive feelings. Anxiety is a function of stuff that people do that brings on anxious feelings. And talent, like talent for public speaking, is not a function of something people have. It's a function of stuff that people do in order to bring out very, very nicely done performances. It's looking for the talent or questioning oneself and whether, do I have the talent for this, is a fool's errand, in my opinion, that has been assigned to us by a perspective on human behavior that I don't consider useful. What we need to do is tell people, no, it's not something you have, it's something you need to start doing. And as you do it, you'll get better and better at it. And then when you get really good, if you want to say you have talent, fine. But actually what you've achieved is the capacity to perform, which is a function of performing, not something that's deep inside you like a talent. And as you do it more and more, I guess you would accumulate what we're calling confidence. I don't like to think about it that way because confidence is stuff that people do, not stuff that people have. That's the point I would want to make. And get out there and start speaking.
Excellent words to leave us on. Pat, thanks so much again for joining us for the third time. And hopefully the benefits from appearing on the show continue in 2018.
Next time you talk to me, I'll have a bigger house yet and a bigger car.
Alrighty, folks. Thank you to Chartlytics and Operant Coffee for sponsoring this show. Check them out at chartlytics.com and operantcoffee.com for more info. And until the next time, I will see you in session 43. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.